What theologians, Reformed or otherwise, have inspired you the most in forming your view of the federal vision?
This is going to sound like I'm being cute or glib, but I'm not.
Paul?
But Paul, yeah. Or almost as bad. John Calvin would be probably the principal one. And say John Calvin, the theologians who wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith, and among modern theologians, someone like John Murray. And this was so this is sort of the oddity of how I came to what is now called federal vision stuff. I was a conservative evangelical who became a Calvinist in 1988. And then in 93, about 5 years later, I became a Paedo-Baptist, covenantal Paedo-Baptist. When I became a Paedo-Baptist, this was the result of having become a Calvinist. I sort of emerged from modern evangelical conservatism into a more robust, reformed historical. And so I started reading the Puritans and Westminster Confession and John Calvin. I started doing all this. And since I'd abandoned my individualistic assumptions, I was just learning from these reformers. Then after sort of this all came together and took shape, I found myself accused by a bunch of other reform types of, going over to Rome or.
Right.
But I think what happened is I went from Atlanta or Macon, Georgia. I went from Macon, Georgia to Geneva, and a lot of people thought I went to Rome because it's over a lot of water and it's to the east, so to the east
Right.
somewhere. And it was borne in on me that a lot of American Presbyterians do not know their own tradition. They don't know what the Westminster Confession of Faith says. They don't know what it means. This year, there's a publishing project that I'm really looking forward to. The editor's name is Dix, I believe, where they're publishing an annotated set of the minutes of the Westminster Assembly, which is, I think, going to blow the barn doors off of a lot of this,
Right.
a lot of this stuff. The Westminster Confession of Faith does not teach sort of the deracinated Reformed faith that has come to be in America because of compromises with the prevailing Baptistic ethos.
Right.
Reformed Baptists, God bless them, and there's a lot of things that American Baptist culture has going for it. God bless them too. But historic Presbyterians have accommodated themselves to a lot of Baptistic assumptions. And if you go from a modern setting back to a historic confessionally reformed position as it existed between 1500 and 1700, well, 1517, and 1700. If you go into that era, you're going to find, and you just adopt it and say what those guys said, you're going to be run out of town on a rail. John Calvin could not get ordained in the average American presbytery.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who do you think would get him in trouble?
His view of the sacraments, for example. Given for You is a fine book by Keith Matheson on Calvin's view of the supper. That would be one thing that would get Calvin in trouble. Another would be his views on faith and works. Of course, Calvin, like Luther, held to justification by faith alone, as do I. But the way that has been parsed out, where historically the Reformed held that there was a fiducia, a sensus, and notitia, knowledge, assent, and trust were the components of a living, saving faith. Well, that'll get you attacked. If you say, "I believe that we are justified by a living faith alone," people would get nervous at that adjective, living. And I say, "What do you think? Do you think we're justified by dead faith? What are you talking? What are you talking about?" This is the historic Reformed position, and there are many people who are just playing politics, or they're ignorant and don't know their own tradition.
So what about the places where you do seem to have gone beyond the reformers in one way or another with ideas like doctrine of paedo communion?
Yeah. So how did I come to paedo communion, given that Calvin addresses that explicitly in the Institutes?
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I should say is I came to paedo communion very slowly, because when I was a Baptist, I saw paedo communion as a logical necessity given paedobaptism,
Mm-hmm.
and I used it as an argument
Right.
against paedobaptism. You know, if you
Mm-hmm.
baptize them, then why not offer them communion? Ho ho ho.
Right.
And in arguing that way, when and as a Baptist, I was accustomed to saying, the reformers are great. Two cheers for the reformers. They did a great job extricating themselves from Romish clutches, but they should have gone farther.
Right.
Right. So that's the Reformed Baptist argument. The reformers are great. Hats off to them, but they should have gone farther. They didn't go quite far enough. They didn't reform the church quite enough. And that was my argument as a Calvinistic Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
that the reformers did great but didn't go far enough. As soon as when I became a Calvinist, it was a real humbling thing for me. It was just epistemologically humbling, and so when I became a Calvinist, I resolved that I was not going to use that argument for a while
Mm-hmm.
on something like paedo communion. I became a paedo Baptist in sort of paedo communion circles. You know,
Mm-hmm.
some people I knew were paedo communionists, and I was reluctant and drug my heels for quite a while, for some years actually, because I wanted to repent of that slander of the reformers,
Mm-hmm.
that they didn't go quite far enough. Now, it happens that I finally, after some years, came to the conclusion that on child communion, I think that a more consistent position would require taking the next step. But I wanted to take that step when I took it sort of with all due and appropriate humility with regard to the reformers. It was because it was earlier when I was a Baptist, it was just too glib, too easy,
Uh-huh.
too facile to say. But I think that Calvin's desire for weekly communion, which he could not get past the Geneva City Council,
Right.
and given his doctrine of what happens in communion, I believe that sets up tensions within the Reformed system as a whole, and there are different ways to resolve the tension.
Mm-hmm.
One way is to go in a Baptistic direction. The other is to go in the direction of child communion.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that there was an unresolved tension that the heirs of the reformers
Uh-huh.
had to take up, and in North America, that tension has been largely resolved by going in a Baptistic direction.
Mm-hmm.
The Federal Vision people are resolving the same tension by adopting child communion.
Okay.